It's important that we recognize not everybody is on the same page when it comes to diversity awareness. For those of us that care about these issues, this is like a no-brainer. But for those that are not aware, that are struggling, that maybe are resisting diversity initiatives, often it's because they have not evolved along the diversity awareness continuum, and they actually have some concerns about diversity and the ways people that differ. So let's start with the continuum. It goes from denial all the way up to integration. And denial is basically those who don't believe that anybody who is not a white male has any value. These are usually white supremacists. We hear about them all the time in the news, unfortunately. I remember when I first did these lectures and I was like, oh, those people, they exist, but they're pretty quiet. Well, not so much anymore. They're actually quite vocal. A lot of the Project 2025 documentation that has been promoted by the Heritage Foundation is about white supremacy and white nationalism, and that only white issues and white concerns and white perspectives and white history matter. So these are people that are denial of cultural differences. They don't believe they matter. When we believe that slavery was beneficial for Black people, that is a denial that anybody else's culture or perspectives matter. And so the 1620 Project was a lot about trying to shift people's perspectives to see the world through the eyes of those who came to this country, to understand the history, and not just the history that we were taught as little children, but to actually understand through original documents and legislation and things like that what actually occurred for those who came to this country involuntarily and were enslaved. So people in denial live very isolated from other cultures. They don't want to expose themselves. And in fact, they think anybody that's not like them is subhuman or not worth their attention. And so, again, they exist. They're not a majority, but they absolutely exist. And they will probably be in your workplace. They will probably be there. They'll be subtle. They won't talk about it, or maybe they will, but many won't for fear of losing their jobs. But they absolutely are in denial about the value of any kind of diversity or differences. The next level up is defensive, or the defensiveness of an individual. And if you have any memory or have heard about Archie Bunker and the television show All in the Family, Archie Bunker was a great example of somebody who was defensive. They usually engage in stereotypes because they attach a negative evaluation to anything that's different than them. This is a little bit different than those in denial, because those in denial don't even think about anybody as having any value. Whereas defensiveness is like, okay, well, we are different, but they don't like those differences. Those differences are bad or wrong or totally out of line and not something that we should be focused on. That your culture is really the only viable one, and those people over there, they can stay and do their own thing. You see them as people, right? Whereas those in denial don't see the others as anything of value or even human. So defensiveness is basically engaging in stereotypes, mostly because of fear, right? When people are afraid of things different than them, it's easy to denigrate it, to tease it, to make fun of it, to poke fun of it, to put it down so that I can feel better about myself, right? But once we step away from that and we recognize that by doing that, we're hurting other people, as we saw in All in the Family and then Archie's Place, which was a show that happened after that series ended, Archie's defensiveness diminished because he became exposed to so many different people, understanding and seeing the world through different eyes, and he became less defensive. And he recognized that differences were not so scary after all. But it's a really interesting trajectory to watch that. And interesting also to think about Carol Connor, who played the role of Archie Bunker. This person was polar opposite of who he was. He's a very inclusive, very huge person that really valued diversity. And so playing somebody who was racist and bigoted and engaged in stereotypes was a very difficult challenge for him to stretch out of that role and to see the world through different eyes. At the next level is minimization. And in the minimization, this idea is that we're minimizing differences. Like, your blood's the same color as mine. Those differences don't matter. I don't see color. Color doesn't matter at all. Sex doesn't matter at all. You're the same as me. And that sounds really good on its surface. It really does, right? Because we like to believe I don't see race, I don't see color. But number one, it's disingenuous because we do. We do see race. We do see color. We do see gender. We do see, people at pride events wearing rainbows and knowing that, what their sexual orientation is. It's different than my own. And that's disingenuous to say you don't see it, because you do. It's there. It's out there. We might consciously not act on those differences, right? We might not consciously discriminate, but this is where we start to recognize that unconscious bias can play a role here. You might say, I wouldn't act on that, I would never do that, but unconscious bias does play a role, and we'll talk about unconscious bias in a bit. Minimization, though, doesn't help us because people are different. Whether we're different based on personalities or different based on race or ethnic origin or sex or sexual orientation or any of those categories, no matter what it is, whether they're the immutable ones, the internal, or whether they are the big, external differences, people have differences, and they are meaningful differences. So I'll give you an example of an experience I had with my mother-in-law who was Black. She's died a few years ago, so I'm using the past tense in that context. And I would have a conversation with her, and one time we were chatting about the fact that she was driving with her white husband from New York City down to Washington, D.C. to visit her family who were in Washington, D.C. And apropos of whatever, I don't even remember why we were having this discussion, she turned around and she said, and I told Lou, who was her husband, that if we didn't eat lunch by the time we got to Philadelphia, we wouldn't be able to eat until we got to Washington, D.C. And I looked at her, and I understand this was in the mid-50s when this occurred. And I'm thinking to myself, I know there weren't major highways, but you can't tell me that there weren't restaurants somewhere between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. that she couldn't eat at. And then she looked at me and she patted me metaphorically on the head and said, oh, honey child, did you forget about Jim Crow? And I went, yeah, I did. Why did I forget about it? Because it wasn't my life experience. It wasn't within the realm of my experiences. So therefore, I didn't think about it. And when I understood why, right, why it mattered, I recognized suddenly that minimizing differences, not recognizing that this Black woman had a very different experience than me as a suburban white woman, that we were going to have really different experiences and see the world differently and experience the world differently. And that shifted for me to go from this idea that everybody's blood's the same, we're all human beings. Yes, and Black people still experience the world differently. Straight people experience the world differently than those who are gay. Black different from white and from Latino and from Native American and from Asians, right? Everybody experiences the world in a different manner, even because of how they present themselves as, whatever skin tone or facial features or, you name it, they have. They experience the world differently and the world experiences them differently. And because of that, I realized, wow, then that's too simplistic. It has to be better than that. I have to be better than that. And so those first three levels, denial, defensiveness, and minimization, are what we call ethnocentric perspectives, meaning that, those differences don't matter, or if if we do have differences, they're wrong, they're bad, or they're subhuman and they don't matter. That means only my point of view matters. But as we move up to the last three, the acceptance and adaptation and integration, those categories are far more about accepting that differences are okay, even if they're a little scary. Differences are still okay, that we are going to have and recognize that people are different. And acceptance doesn't mean you have to agree, but it just means you recognize that even if I disagree with you, I recognize that your opinion is as valuable as mine, that my way isn't the only way to do things, right? Same thing with adaptation, where we use knowledge to sort of fit into a culture. This whole adage, right? When in Rome, we do as the Romans do. When you go to a foreign country, you respect those customs. Anybody who has ever traveled knows, right? You go to the Middle East, if you eat food with your right hand, I believe it's your right hand, that's considered unclean. And so you never eat food with your right hand. You always use your left hand when you feed yourself. Same thing with, you know, different cultures, different foods, different ways of interacting with others. We have to fit in and do things the way they're done, and the customs and the codes are the way that they're done in another country. We don't get to walk in as the ugly Americans and say, but this is the way it needs to be done because this is how we do it. It's just different for everybody. Learning about those different cultures is what makes it so rich and so interesting. And then lastly, this notion of integration. And integration basically means we don't even think about it, right? We just seamlessly move from culture to culture and people to people. And we recognize that there are different cultural frameworks within which to understand something. And that, you know, in order for us to be able to understand different cultures, we have to experience them and respect them, that they are going to be different in the way that we see things, and that we can obviously clearly understand that they are more complex, than a simple yes or no thing. That's how we have to evaluate behaviors and understand and interpret what the other group is doing. These are what we call ethno-relativistic perspectives. So ethnocentric versus ethno-relativistic is recognizing that differences aren't scary, they're just different. Different is okay. Understanding why it's different and then finding common ground and moving forward is really the goal. And that's what we learn with acceptance and adaptation and integration. These next couple of slides will probably be a review for you if you've taken MBA 522 already, or you've taken any international business classes. You've probably heard about, national culture and things like that. I know we talk about it in MBA 522. I do want to point out a couple of different things, how it's different from what you probably learned in MBA 522, and we'll be updating MBA 522 materials accordingly. Number one, it's no longer called masculinity and femininity as dimensions. It's actually called motivation for achievement, low motivation for achievement, high motivation for achievement. High motivation for achievement is what we used to call masculine culture, and low motivation for achievement is what we consider more feminine culture. But that feminine masculine thing is really outdated, so they've moved forward with changing the name to motivation for achievement. The other thing that's different is the Nordic cultures have moved far more to the right towards high levels of individualism in Nordic cultures. And so more recent reviews of Nordic cultures is that they are higher in individualism than initially thought. Other than that, things are basically the same. The dimensions are individualism, power distance, uncertainty avoidance, the motivation for achievement, and then long-term orientation or time orientation on things. And so we'll talk about them quite quickly in the next couple slides. As a quick review for those of you that have already had it, but information for those of you that have not studied this yet, power distance has to do with our comfort with differences in levels of power. Here in the United States, we are not as comfortable with power distances. In fact, we're not as deferent to power, moderately for us, but not high. And so we err more on the side of things being a little bit more egalitarian, but we still believe that there's hierarchies and things like that. Cultures where there's high power distances, particularly in Asian cultures and some Arab countries and African countries. Low power distance is more in Germanic, Austrian, and Danish cultures where everything is very flat and egalitarian. Iceland is a great example as well. Um, Individualism and collectivism, again, Nordic cultures have actually moved quite high. We are pretty high up there, but we're not the highest anymore, and I don't recall who the highest was, but we are still fairly individualistic in this country. That's no denying it, and I suspect that the numbers have shifted a little bit because we have done so much training for people to learn how to work more collectively in teams, to be more collaborative. Although the rugged individual myth, right, is still a big one here for the United States. But many different cultures have different perspectives on individualism versus collectivism. But Asian cultures in particular are far higher on the collectivist culture, African culture. They don't use the word I, it's all we in African cultures, to my understanding. Latin America also very focused on the collective, not on individuals in and of themselves. Um, and Japan and Arab countries are kind of in the middle. There's some emphasis on individualism, but also on collective responsibility. So it's kind of a balanced approach to things, if you will. So the last three categories: uncertainty avoidance, motivation to achievement, and long-term orientation. Again, fairly predictable. Uncertainty avoidance in the U.S., we are pretty okay with uncertainty. Not as okay as some other cultures, like Nordic cultures tend to be much more accepting of this. Chinese cultures actually tend to be very comfortable with uncertainty, but other cultures are not. Japan has high uncertainty avoidance. A lot of German-speaking countries, particularly, in things in Eastern Europe, Russia, for example, tend to be high in uncertainty avoidance. They don't like uncertainty at all. And like I said, we are sort of in the middle to the lower end of avoidance. We actually are okay with some uncertainty, despite liking, our plans in front of us. Motivation to achievement. Again, high levels are what used to be called masculinity. Low levels used to be called femininity. And again, everything fairly standard. Norway and Sweden are much more feminine cultures, are more low motivation for achievement and success. Doesn't mean that they don't like to achieve and don't like to be successful, but they're not highly motivated by it. They're much more motivated by more collective belonging, to getting along together, collaborative sort of things, as opposed to achievement and individual achievement specifically. High achievement cultures are things like Japan and some European countries. The UK is in the middle. We are in the middle, more like the UK, sort of on the slightly more motivated by achievement scale. And then long-term orientation has to do with sort of the way that we think about time and the focus of time. We are not long-term. We are very short-term in our focus here in the United States, whereas Asian cultures tend to be much more focused on the long-term of time, rather.